We are currently 6 episodes into the final 10-episode season of Superman and Lois, which, when the season ends after the next 4 episodes, it's going to be the end of a 23-year straight run of DC shows on the CW, really an end of an era, an end of the Arrowverse era as well of DC as a whole, because whether or not you consider Superman and Lois as an Arrowverse show, the show would not exist without the Arrowverse, so it feels like it's sort of closing that sort of moment of DC as well. But this is a video that I really wanted to make since like episode 3 came out, but I just kept putting it off, and now since we only have 4 episodes left, I kind of wanted to have a few weeks of making normal Superman and Lois reviews before the show ended, so kind of have to get this video out now before the final run of episodes begins. But I really don't want this video to seem overly negative, despite what the title is, and the title is correct, where at the moment I don't really know how I feel about the final season of Superman and Lois. I don't know whether, when all is said and done, if I'm going to look back on it and be like, oh, I actually really loved season 4, or if I'm going to look back on it and be like, oh, I actually hated season 4. But I mean, I have major criticisms of what they've done this season so far, but I also have things that I'm majorly on board with, like that I'm like, oh, this is some of the best stuff that Superman and Lois has ever done in its entire run. So it leads to this kind of conflicted thing where it's like, do the positives so far outweigh the negatives for me, or do the negatives so far outweigh the positives for me? I'm not really entirely sure. Now, just going forward, there's going to be spoilers for the first 6 episodes of Superman and Lois Season 4, so if you haven't seen those episodes, maybe steer clear. There's not going to be huge spoilers outside of the first, 3 episodes, but still, there's going to be spoilers for bits from each episode, so maybe if you haven't seen them or not, don't check out this video. But I guess before talking about all that sort of stuff, a good place to start is kind of to give a brief summary of what the behind-the-scenes stuff has been with the show over the last couple of years that has led to why Season 4 is the way it is. And if you're not familiar with any of this, the CW was bought a couple of years back, new ownership. The new ownership changed how all of the CW dealt with their renewals and their cancellations and their budgeting for their shows across everything. And this led to a massed cancellation or forced ending for almost all of their shows so far. All of their DCTV shows and Arrowverse shows were not exempt from this. It was included in there, where Batwoman and Legends of Tomorrow were both flat out cancelled with no warning, and then The Flash and Superman and Lois were given forced, shortened final seasons. And these weren't cancellations because the shows were allowed to continue, The Flash and Superman and Lois, that is, but we do know for a fact that both shows would have continued going forward if they were allowed to. Eric Wallace, the showrunner for The Flash, has talked about his ideas for Season 10 if they weren't forced to end at Season 9. And Superman and Lois, Todd Helbing, the showrunner for Superman and Lois, has also talked about their plans for Seasons 5, 6, and 7. Things like the Phantom Zone and stuff like that would have been included if the show got to go past Season 4. And I guess because of the fact that Superman and Lois is being forced to end with this season, they are trying to put a lot of their ideas from Seasons 5, 6, and 7 into Season 4. And some of my issues kind of lie there, where it feels like we don't have the time for a lot of these extra or new elements being brought into the show. And it feels like they don't really fit here, but I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. Now, there's already been a lot of people who are dismissing any criticisms of Season 4 and saying it's not fair to criticize Superman and Lois Season 4 because of 2 things, because the budget and because of the shortened 10-episode count. And I don't want to dismiss the budget cuts as just being something to work around, because the budget cut slashes have been pretty severe. It's clear that whatever the budget was in the first few seasons was vastly bigger than what they have to deal with this season. Because, we've lost well over half the cast. We know the writer's room was pretty much split down the middle, with certain writers only being allowed to return for 1 or 2 episodes each. We know that the Kent Farm set they had to vacate at the end of Season 3. I'm not sure what the reason was. I've heard some people say it was due to the owners. Other people say just the budget wasn't there to keep using the Season 3 set, which is why exterior shots of the farm this season either are repurposed shots from earlier seasons. Like, if you notice them, you'll be like, oh, that looks exactly identical to a shot we would have had in Season 1 or Season 2. And other reasons being as well that, we'll have super close-ups or whatever that kind of blocks out the fact that we're not actually on the Kent Farm set. The VFX one is kind of a weird one to talk about, because some episodes very clearly have better VFX than other episodes. I think episode 1, for example, looks fantastic, so I'm sure episode 1 had a bigger budget than episode 3 did, which didn't look as good. But I mean, that's just shows in general. Premieres get more budget than, mid-season episodes do. On top of this, and this next bit is just kind of a guess on my end, but so this isn't a confirmed thing, but I'm a really huge fan of soundtracks and scores for TV shows and movies. And one thing that I feel like I've noticed this season so far is that while there are some bits of music that sound amazing, other bits of music sound like they're just a lot, like other episodes feel like they're just reusing a lot of themes from the earlier seasons, so maybe the budget has slightly affected the music or the soundtrack as well, but that's just a complete guess on my end. But I mean, putting all of this out there like this, it just says how insanely big the budget cuts were. Most TV shows do experience budget cuts in their later seasons. It's pretty unavoidable. Contracts get more expensive, which means there's less money to go around for things like sets or writers or whatever. That happens a lot. But just in general, budget cuts are a very expected thing in later seasons of the show. But it really does feel like Superman and Lois' fourth season that they've had budget cuts that are far more extensive and far more severe than most shows experience. The episode count, I think, isn't really worth talking about because most shows do see episode counts reduced for their final seasons, and most shows do have to find ways to work around that episode count. I know Arrow isn't a super popular show among some of the DC fandom, but I love Arrow. I think it's a great show. They had a 10-episode final season, so a severely reduced final season from their usual 22 to 23 episode seasons. And Arrow did not experience huge budget cuts as Superman and Lois experienced, but I always point to Arrow as like a perfect final season because it's season 8 felt like they handled the 10-episode count masterfully, where every single episode was extremely important, or every single episode did something that felt like it was super impactful. Some episodes of season 8 felt like they were telling half a season of story in the one episode, and I think that it's really amazing how they did that, and that's like why I would say the reduced episode count isn't always a problem. Sometimes some shows can use it to their full potential, where they take a reduced episode count and it means that they have to remove a lot of the usual filler so that we just have 10 episodes of really, really concise and tight storytelling. Now, speaking to the budget cuts, I think budget cuts are a lot of the time just a challenge for a writer to showcase how good they really are. Like showcase how they can get around the fact that they don't have certain things to play with anymore. And one of my favorite shows of all time is Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Actually, my top 2 favorite shows of all time are Arrow and Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. And every single season of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., they were on the verge of cancellation. It just got worse and worse and worse every season up until season 5. And then they'd get renewed, and normally it was Marvel stepping in, telling ABC, you know, hey, will you just renew Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.? We kind of still need a presence on ABC. And a big reason why ABC would be okay renewing Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. was because they would usually reduce the budget more every season. And I mean, seasons 4 and 5 of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. are considered by a lot of the people who've seen them to be some of the best things that Marvel has ever put out. And seasons 4 and 5 experienced huge budget cuts. Like, those seasons are filmed on pennies compared to what seasons 1 through 3 were filmed on. Like, season 5, for example, was so cheap that the lighthouse set for that season, which they used throughout the whole 3 final seasons, was pretty much the same grey, boring hallways for the entire 22 episodes. Yet, because the writing on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is so fucking good, and the characters are so well written, and the story is so compelling, you don't feel it. You don't feel that you're in the same set for the entire season. You don't feel like there's budget cuts, because everything else in the show is still so good. And I think it's also slightly comparable in the episode count, because Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Season 5 was split into 2 storylines. The first storyline was 10 episodes long, just like Superman and Lois has 10 episodes this season. Now, I don't have the exact numbers for the budgets, obviously, but it's clear that Superman and Lois has received budget cuts that are much more severe than anything Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. experienced. Like, S.H.I.E.L.D. didn't have to lose half of its cast, but the point I'm trying to make here is that a budget doesn't equal quality. You could have $20 million an episode, and the writing being bad means that the show is going to be bad. You could have $1 million an episode, but the writing being great means that the show could maybe be great. So I think, you know, at the end of the day, $20 million an episode with bad writing means you're going to have a bad show. $1 million an episode with good writing means you're going to have a good show. You're going to take the $1 million episode over the $20 million episode every time if it means the writing is good. So what I'm trying to say here is that if you have good writers, a budget doesn't matter. You should be able to work around it and still keep the show interesting. So that's why when people are bringing up budget cuts, being like, you can't criticize season 4 of Superman and Lois because they have huge budget cuts, I'm like, most shows get budget cuts. Writers work around it. If you like the show, if you think the show is good, budget cuts shouldn't matter about it. But to get into actually talking about the season and the episodes itself, I was really, really, really into the first 3 episodes. Episode 3 is one that took a bit of time for me to get for me to fall in love with, the same as everyone else did, because I remember when it first came out, Everyone was like, this is one of the best episodes of the show. Some people were even like, this is one of the best episodes of comic book television ever. But I rewatched the episode a bunch of times before episode 4 came out, and the Sam Lane stuff was just getting better and better and better on every rewatch for me, where I was like really invested in it more every single time I'd rewatch it. And I think a good indicator of how much I really am enjoying a show is how much I will rewatch an episode before the next episode comes out. I mean, this is a me thing. Like, I don't expect most people watching a show to feel a need to rewatch entire episodes before the next one comes out. But I'm somebody who, like, if I'm really invested in a show, when I'm watching it weekly, I'll tend to rewatch episodes a couple times before the next one comes out, because I enjoy watching it again. And for me, Superman and Lois, the first 3 episodes were exactly that, where I was rewatching them all before the next episodes would come out. Then that kind of fell off a little bit for episodes 4 and 5, where I haven't felt the need to rewatch them at all, where there was nothing really in the episodes that were bringing me back or making me want to revisit them. And episode 6, the most recent episode, brought that back for me, where I was like, oh, this is kind of sick, like I need to rewatch this a couple times. But there was a tone or a feeling in the first 3 episodes that I absolutely loved. Like, between everything with Superman's death and Lois coming to terms with it all, and Jordan being the one trying to protect the family and going after Lex, then the whole situation with Sam, everything felt so dire, and like there was a real urgency to the storyline. I can't explain it very well, but I was really, really, really on board with what they were doing in these episodes. Like, I felt like a lot of these characters were really in the darkest periods of their lives, sort of thing. And it felt like they were facing this threat and this issue that they couldn't overcome. Like, this was easily the worst thing that they've had to face. And I think the decision to break up the Superman Doomsday fight and then sort of intercut various moments in the episode with a brief scene of the fight was a great idea. Like, was really well done, and really kind of made the fight feel like it was lasting long and feel serious. And you could see the transition of how much Tyler Clark was getting beat up and how much worse the fight was getting for him and stuff like that. I know that they actually released that whole fight scene back at San Diego Comic-Con in July, where it was like every scene of the fight from the first episode was just edited together to make one long fight, and they released that scene. Now, I actually didn't watch it because I tend to never watch scenes of episodes that are released before the episodes come out. I'll watch trailers for sure, but for actual full scenes that are released of episodes, I normally like to more experience them in the episodes themselves, because I feel like a scene of an episode is gonna change. Like, your feelings on that scene will change dependent on the context of the episode, like dependent on the context on the scenes before it or after it. I feel like watching a scene out of context that's just taken from an episode never really does it the service as it will as if you've seen the entire episode. My mic. So for this reason, when they released that scene, I was like, I'm not going to check this out. I'll wait and I'll experience it in the episode. But I ended up being really, really, really glad that I did this, because this San Diego edit for the scene doesn't really give you a feeling of the size or the scale or even the timeline of the fight. But when you watch the episode itself, you realize that this fight is going on for like 24 hours. And then you're just seeing Clark get absolutely wrecked in that time period. And I think that, doing this in the episode was really, really well done. And like, I guess just to maybe talk about the VFX stuff here, I think there was, clearly more budget put into episode 1, because this whole fight scene looked so good. Like, this whole fight between Clark and Doomsday here was easily the best live-action Superman Doomsday fight we've ever had. I'm a big fan of Batman v Superman. I know a lot of people aren't. We'll talk about that here. But I think that the Doomsday aspect of that film is easily the weakest part of that film. And I think that the Doomsday Superman fight in that film, despite the fact that it's in a I don't know how much that film cost, like $200 million film, and the fight there didn't hit nearly as well as the fight in Superman and Lois season 4 episode 1, where they slashed budget did. Like, they did a great job with that fight scene. And it was also just very visually interesting, I felt like, because we're not used to seeing Superman fight in space, and kind of seeing him, fighting through an asteroid belt or whatever that was. I think the visuals of space around them just created a really unique look that I don't think we're used to seeing in live action Superman stuff. But I thought the first episode really was like a 10 out of 10 on this point. And I guess to bring up the changes in VFX for the following episodes, I remember thinking that like the steel suit scenes in episode 3 looked really clunky and quite cheap. And I mean, like, it didn't look great, but I also think that this looking cheap is a good trade-off if we get episode 1 looking as good as it did. Like, if they would have had to make episode 1 look worse to make the suit scenes in episode 3 look better, I would have hated that. I'm glad we got things the way we did. Beyond this, I think how the Kent family dynamic was handled in these episodes was also really, really, really well done. Like, you could feel the pain that Lois is going through. It felt like Jordan and Jonathan were having some really great story arcs. I remember at the beginning of episode 4 where we see sort of Jordan's head tilt as he's hearing Clark come back and he's hearing it before anybody else. That's like such a chilling scene. Like, I really liked that, and I kind of really liked, outside of the phone call stuff with Lois picking Jordan or Jonathan, I mean, I think that was dragged out a little bit needlessly long for drama purposes, but outside of that, I think the early episodes did a really good job of showcasing Jordan and his abilities up until Jonathan gets his powers. The scene where Jonathan and Jordan are arguing in episode 3, like the scene right as Jonathan's about to get his powers, but before he finds out, and we have Jonathan arguing and shouting about how his dad's dead and Jordan was just doing things and bitching and moaning and all that sort of stuff. I felt like that was Jonathan's best scene in the entire show, to be honest. And I don't mean just the actor Michael Bishop, since he replaced the old actor. I mean, just in general, out of the entire 4 seasons of Jonathan's scenes, that was the best scene with that character in the show, in my opinion. I thought that the acting was phenomenal, but I just thought in general the writing in that scene was really well done. You felt like you were in Jonathan's head for a moment. Like, it was really well done. I also really, really, really liked how they handled Clark's absence in these early episodes. Like, using him in brief flashbacks still had him be present, because I know if he wasn't in any of the 3 episodes, that would have been a little bit unfortunate for a final season. But it felt like putting him in those flashbacks had him still be a constant part of the show. Like, you didn't feel like Clark was completely gone, but you still felt the absence of Superman as a character in the present day stuff. And this is pretty clearly the best version of Death of Superman storyline that's been done in live action, in my opinion. But I think that's honestly just down to the fact that this version of Superman has a family. He is married to Lois, he has kids. We're not used to seeing a version of the Death of Superman storyline, even in the comics, where Superman has kids or is married to Lois like this. And Lex Luthor has also been an absolute force in these episodes. It's a version of Lex we're also not used to seeing. Very, very, very intimidating. Very big, very muscly, very shouty. We're not used to him being this intimidating or this scary. Like, when you think of Lex Luthor, you don't tend to think of a character that is intimidating and scary in front of you. It's like, he's always clever, he's always conniving, he's always the mastermind, but is he ever just in front, like when he's standing in front of you, are you ever intimidated by that guy? Not usually, but Superman and Lois's version is doing that. Every episode with him, your attention is all on him. And episode 6, focusing on him with the whole fight with Clark and just all that sort of stuff. That whole fight as well just felt like it was this season's diner scene from season 3. So it's just really, really, really well done. Now, I'm just going to go into some of the things that I'm not as crazy about in this season. And a lot of this stuff kind of goes hand in hand with the things I've been mentioning that I'm actually liking. But it's like, I guess some things I'm like, oh, I think this storyline is really, really good. But then there's a but to it. You know, I think a lot of my things that I'm liking, there's a reason why I'm also not liking it. And a lot of things I'm not liking, there's still a reason why I'm kind of liking it. Which is, I think, what's leading me to be conflicted on this season. It's like, I don't feel like there's anything I'm just completely on board with, but there's nothing I'm completely not on board with either, if that makes sense. The first thing I guess that is important to talk about is the cast being very much different. And it's weird because I think there are both pros and cons to the cast being very smaller and to us not focusing on the 6, 7, side characters we usually would have taking up a lot of screen time in any given episode. And I actually had a conversation with this during episodes 3 and 4 with my good friend Darren, friend of the channel. But he was kind of talking about how the show has always been about the people of Smallville. How the show has always kind of been focusing and showcasing on slice of life moments of a small American town. Now, obviously, not American. I was in New York once, like 20 years ago, but outside of that, never been to America. Don't have much in common with how Smallville portrays the town itself and what life is like inside of it. But I do agree with Darren that the characters have always been an integral part of the show. Like Lana, Chrissy, Kyle, John Henry, Nat, Sarah, all of them have been integral characters to the show. And the show 100% feels different without them. Now, my least favorite season of Superman and Lois is season 2. And a big part of that is because I felt like season 2 took the focus off of the main Kents far too much. I mean, it's expected that the show is not always going to focus on them. It's expected we're going to have a lot of these side storylines going on. But season 2, in my opinion, took it to a bit of an extreme extent. And that we'd have entire arcs where things like Lana running for mayor, or Kyle cheating would be given just as much focus and just as much importance of what is going on with Clark or what is going on with Lois. And season 3 still had some of these issues for me, where things like Kyle and Chrissy would sometimes take up too much focus of an episode. But in general, season 3 had such a well done focus on the Lois and Cancer storyline that it's hard to fault season 3 too much. But to me, it's weird because I think a big part of my love for these first 3 episodes are because for the first time since season 1, I felt like the show had an extremely tight and well done focus on just the Kents, on just the main characters of the show. I felt like we weren't cutting between 3 or 4 unconnected storylines at once, which I think is kind of par for the course with the show, where we've got so many storylines going on, so much juggling at once, that sometimes the important things in the show can get lost in the shuffle. But instead, in these early episodes, everyone that was on screen were focused on the same things, the same goals. Even when Lana and Sarah showed up in episode 2, their storylines were still very much tied to Lex Luthor and what is going on with the Kents. You know, like it felt like even though we were bringing these characters back in, we weren't dealing with all of the storylines happening at once, separate storylines. That it was all still focused on the main plot of the season. And I mean, it felt like a different show, but I mean that in a good way. And then episode 4 came along, and I felt like things started to fall away a little bit from what I felt the first 3 episodes were, as we were all of a sudden spending an entire episode on Chrissy and Kyle's wedding. And while I understand the necessity to give them a conclusion, given their importance to the show so far, I felt like that episode came at such an unneeded time. And it's hard to say it's unneeded time because we've got a 10 episode short and final season. Where would the time be to do it if not now? But I don't know. We got Clark Kent back revived at the beginning of episode 4. And right as Clark comes back, I don't think that's the best time to focus on Kyle and Chrissy for an episode. Honestly, I think a better idea would just to have them say they're not getting married, because the end of episode 4 reveals the whole wedding thing was kind of pointless because they're not getting married anyway. But I think that the right thing to do in this situation, and again, I don't write for the show, so this is just completely an opinion, but my opinion here would have been that you just say that the 2 characters decided off screen that they're not getting married, give it a line of dialogue about it, and that's it. The episode doesn't focus on any of that. Because when there are so many other important things to wrap up or deal with, you kind of have to be cutthroat about what you give the time to and what you don't. Like what you think deserves screen time and what you think doesn't. And I think this is one of those cases where there are things more important to the show than Kyle and Chrissy's relationship getting a wrap up. And I guess to go more in depth about this, I mean Clark's return. Like specifically in this situation I'm talking about, Clark's return. Now, I don't think him returning in episode 3 was rushed. I've seen a lot of people say that they don't feel like he should have come back that soon, that there should have been more time with him not being alive to give more impact. But I think him staying dead for 3 episodes is the perfect amount of time. I think especially in a 10 episode short and final season, you can't really keep Clark Kent dead for longer than that. You need to bring him back by then. I think him getting Sam's heart and that leading to the whole struggle of him being more human now is honestly an incredibly interesting direction for the story to take. And I think that it's really creative as well. It gives a good reason why he's not going to be using his powers as much, which helps out with the budget, which also the fight between him and Lex in the later episodes I think is also a good point of them being creative about when they're using their budget and when they're not. But my issue comes with the aftermath of his revival and his return. And I mean the immediate aftermath. I think the fact that episode 4 spends very, very little time dealing with what his revival means for Clark himself, like on a personal and mental level, like in his headspace. Like, how is this affecting him mentally, the fact that he died and that now he's coming back and he's having to deal with that? Like, we spend no time on this. Like, what was it like for him being dead? How did that feel? We briefly get a slight montage at the beginning of episode 4 where he talks about it, but outside of that, we don't get anything dealing with this. There should be some repercussions for him mentally with the fact that he was dead and now he's alive, and while he was dead, Lex Luthor was just ravaging the town of Smallville. So I think us not dealing with any of this was not the right choice. I think all of this is something that easily deserved an entire episode almost just to deal about. And if this means that you don't do an episode about Chrissy and Kyle's wedding, I think that's an important and needed trade-off for the show. Like, we hear a lot about how the writers are showrunners, or others are talking about what they had to cut because they didn't have time. And I mean, I don't think you can really talk about things that you had to cut and that you didn't have time to do when you spend 25 minutes of an episode on Kyle and Chrissy's relationship. I've seen others say that the first 3 episodes are so dark and depressing that episode 4 is needed to bring a little life back into the show. But I disagree there as well, because I'm like, I think the first 3 episodes were so consistent in their tone that if the entire season keeps that tone, it would make it really good on rewatch. I'm not saying that we don't use Kyle and Chrissy, like you can incorporate them into episodes, just do it the same way you've done with Sarah and Lana in episode 2, where when they show up, they are relevant to what the current storyline for everyone else is, that they're not off doing their own thing, that they're here to support the current storyline. I just don't think that you give them something if it means it's coming at the expense of screen time to the more important things in the show. Now, similarly to the Clark revival, I feel the same about Jonathan gaining powers. I think him getting powers is fine, but I don't love how quick him immediately having all of his powers when it took Jordan years to develop is handled. I feel like this is another situation where episode 4 and maybe even episode 5 should have dealt with completely Clark's return and Jonathan developing his powers, with maybe Jordan trying to help him out. I think something this season would really work with is more of a focus on the Kent character moments, which this would have allowed. Now, I'm not saying I dislike episode 5, I'm not saying you remove episode 5 and do something else with it, because episode 5 is one that's entirely focused on Lex, and I think that's good. That's a good idea. I think a Lex-focused episode is good because it was really fun in season 3 when we had that, and it makes sense to do that now. But episode 5 also deals kind of with Lex's estranged relationship with his daughter Elizabeth, who is played by Elizabeth Henstridge from Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. But I do think, for example, that the flashback to Lex's marriage failing don't really add a lot to the character that we didn't already know. And I actually kind of felt like the scenes with Lex in all the other 5 episodes have been much stronger than what we got in episode 5. And I think the idea of him having a strange relationship with his daughter would really work in a longer season. But when you have a limited episode count and you've limited story time, I think you need to be more conservative in where you put your screen time and what you're putting into your story. And this is also something where I think building on already established stuff like Jonathan's development or Clark's mental state after his return are more important than this stuff with Lex. But I guess then you remove that, you run into a problem with Lex's storyline in season 3 being his big motivation, that he's trying to get back at Lois for losing time with his family and stuff like that. It kind of ruins that. But I think, you know, sometimes you have to wonder, is this worth a whole episode when we still have this to deal with? Again, we still have 4 episodes left. Maybe some of this stuff is going to get touched on, but I don't know. I feel like it probably won't. I don't know. I think a lot of my complaints about the season thus far are just a feeling that season 4 has tended to give a lot of screen time to things that maybe don't need as much as we're getting, and then giving too little screen time to things that should maybe be getting a lot more. But this is also just me. Maybe others don't want to see more of the stuff that I've mentioned and want to see less. But I do think the season maybe has an issue with introducing things that we just don't have time for. Like take Milton Fine, for example. Mentioned back in episode 1, obviously setting up the character of Brainiac, but we only have 4 episodes left. Lex is still going to be a big problem in episode 7 because of the suit, and I also find it very difficult to imagine Lex is going to be wrapped up in the next episode. But we haven't even met pre-Brainiac Milton Fine yet. Doomsday is still out there. I think there's more than enough to deal with without adding Brainiac into the mix. Like, between just Lex and Doomsday, I think that's well enough for a 10-episode season. And Brainiac is such a big and crazy Superman villain that would it feel right if we just got him for 40 minutes in the final? And wouldn't that already take away from what a final should do, which is wrapping up a show? Feels to me that we could end up completely pushing Lex to the side if we bring Brainiac in as well. I don't know, we'll see. There's a video I'm going to make talking about the Superman comic, Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow. Great comic, but it's already a big theory that the ending of the season is going to be very reminiscent of what the ending of Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow was. Won't spoil it, but if you want to know, check out the video when I make it. But there's also a lot in Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, including Brainiac and Lex Luthor, and how the two characters sort of connect and what the two characters are like together. So I think that could maybe inform how we handle the two characters in the later episodes of this season. So look out for that. Anyway, quick bit of housekeeping. This is a bit of a new setup-wise for the videos going forward. I need to fix a lot, like audio probably doesn't sound great. Lighting is terrible. There's shadows everywhere. But hey, you get to see how tired I look all the time. Anyway, let me know how you're finding this setup currently, and if you like it, or if you'd like me to switch back to the old format, if it's something people aren't on board with. But how are you feeling about Superman and Lois Season 4 so far? Liking it? Hating it? What do you expect to see in the last 4 episodes? Let me know. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking, sharing, subscribing, all of that. That would be amazing. And I hope you have an awesome day.